Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about Shadows of Change for Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and Realms of Chaos. And what I want to talk about in this video is the question that quite a lot of people have right now is whether or not Shadows of Change, is it a pay-to-win DLC? Well, it certainly feels like that, like just based on the information we currently have available, and we are certainly going to get a lot more, but with the Changeling and with Yanbo, it does certainly feel, based on the things we've seen, that they are going to be far more powerful than the already existing Legendary Lords for their respective races. Like, you look at a Changeling, he may not have the same kind of empire building ability that Kairos has, but Kairos has an enormous number of problems in his campaign that the Changeling just doesn't have. And then you look at Yanbo, he has more climate, he has better campaign mechanics than the other Legendary Lords of Grand Cafe. It is likely, based on what we've seen so far, and yes, things could be subject to change, and we don't know what kind of racial changes Creative Assembly is going to implement for those factions by overall, but it has to be noted that when they did major racial changes in the past, they did announce that. Like with the Greenskins, with the Greenskin rework, they did announce that they were reworking the Greenskins in, I believe, the very announcement of that DLC pack. They haven't given us such an announcement for the races affected by the Shadows of Change DLC. And while we don't really know anything about Mother Stankia at this particular point, and it's certainly a very tall order for her to end up being far stronger than Boris Ursus, considering the huge amount of power that Boris does have, I do think it wouldn't be unexpected if she also ends up being far stronger than the other Legendary Lords of Kislev. Though being stronger than Catra and Kastalten isn't necessarily a very hard task, given how broken their campaigns are. There are things that Creative Assembly absolutely needs to fix for them, and it doesn't seem like Creative Assembly is giving us those racial changes. But let's take a look at some past examples of where Creative Assembly handled the power creep of DLC relatively well, and where they handled it poorly, because they've done both over the years with the Total War Warhammer games. To talk about situations where Creative Assembly handled the power creep of DLC relatively well, though certainly not perfectly, we can look at the High Elves. One of the best Legendary Lords in the game, not just for his race, is Tyrion, and this is without any kind of DLC for him. Sure, Regiment's Renown help and all that, but fundamentally, Tyrion is really strong with the baseline High Elven army, baseline heroes. The units, heroes, and lords that the DLC adds do help, don't get me wrong on that, but Tyrion is quite formidable. And we look then at the two paid DLC Legendary Lords, Alariel and Elfarion. Certainly both Alariel and Elfarion are very strong Legendary Lords, also some of the very best in the game, but they do have trade-offs for the power they have. Like, Alariel is overall, in a long campaign, the strongest Legendary Lord for the High Elves, and one of the best in the entire game for a very, very long campaign focused on world domination, because she can get more handmaidens than anyone else. She gets a lot of benefits, but she has a lot of negatives associated with her. Her construction cost is significantly higher than the other Legendary Lords for her entire race early on, while she's dealing with the Defender of Ulthuan mechanic, which is also like an anchor that's going to weigh around her neck for much of her campaign. Like, we're talking 40 turns plus 60 turns potentially, where you have to deal with it, because Ulthuan is surrounded on all sides, and if even one bit of territory is not under High Elven control, then the Defender of Ulthuan goes from positive to negative. So Alariel has issues in her campaign. Great deal of power. As for Elfarion, his campaign is complicated by the fact that he starts with an army in the Badlands and also has Story of Rest initially. And how you handle that dynamic will shape your campaign. But keep in mind, Elfarion starts next to Skarbrand, Queek, Warzag. It's not a free ride. While the power is there, they didn't give it a free ride. Tyrion, on the other hand, has as free of a ride as any of them have. Like, look at this campaign situation. This is turn 18, and Tyrion has easy access to 4 or 5 provinces early on. Granted, you're unlikely to take both Safri and Southern of Rest before either Elfarion or Alariel intervene in those wars, but you do have easy access to a huge amount of territory and not really any major opponent to deal with the exception of Count Noctilus, and to be quite blunt, the High Elven early game archers and spearmen will smash through the Vampire Coast roster, complete roster. There's nothing Count Noctilus can do to threaten Tyrion in a campaign. So you have as free of a ride as possible, and you have an enormous amount of power with Tyrion. From the diplomatic relations benefit to the recruitment duration benefit, and then from his both his lord effects for the upkeep and recruit rank for Ladder and Seaguard, but the upkeep for spearmen and archers in particular being very relevant, and then Majesty of Ulthuan with Unifier, Sense of Urgency, and of course Righteous Cause. And then you can also look at another Legendary Lord that is available for free, and that's of course Alifanar. Alifanar is not a paid DLC Legendary Lord, he's a free Legendary Lord that was released at the same time as Queen and the Crown, if I'm not mistaken. Now, playing Alifanar without DLC and not having access to Shadow Warriors will certainly hamper your campaign, but he is still perfectly playable. You just won't be using Shadow Warriors. Instead, you'll make use of archers and shadow walkers, but Alifanar's power doesn't come from the shadow warriors or shadow walkers. It comes from the fact that every army he has a stock stance. It comes from the fact he has the underway mechanic. It comes from the murder missions that give him enormous rewards. And remember, he is available for free. Well, as long as you own, as long as you have access to the High Elf. So basically, as long as you own Warhammer 2, or I guess the Queen and the Crown DLC. Of course, the problem for both Tyrion and Alifanar is that you can't confederate Elfarion and Alariel unless you own their DLC, but for what you get as a baseline, Legendary Lord, as either a baseline Legendary Lord or a free DLC Legendary Lord and Alifanar, is a great deal of power. And this is how I feel it should be done, right? Like, Alariel and Elfarion do have their own unique mechanics, but they do have trade-offs when you're playing their campaigns. Then, of course, we have Grimgor. Grimgor is absurd on a large number of levels. He has a very easy starting position with all the factions surrounding him, even though they are pretty powerful Legendary Lords that surround him, but all the factions around them are easy for him to tackle. Be it talking about Kolic, Astrogoth, Zaytan, or even Drazov, or, yeah, Greasus and the Kafan factions. He would smash them all. Grimgor is so powerful that even in the hands of the AI, this guy becomes one of the most dominant factions on the campaign map. If you start next to him, you need to build your entire campaign plan around dealing with him at one point or another, because he will come for you, and he will annihilate you if you're not careful. What makes Grimgor so powerful, of course, good faction benefits, the Waz having Black Orcs, being extremely powerful, campaign movement range always being good, having a Black Orc big boss being pretty strong, having a good Lord, having good Lord effects, especially the post-battle loot, giving him a significant amount of money, having good skill line. It is really powerful. He's a great fighter in battles. He will kill lords. He will fight entire units on his own and emerge almost unscathed, considering how well he can do things. He does have 2 quest battles that give him a significant amount of gold early on in his campaign. And while he certainly benefits from the DLC, like being able to get nasty skulkers, being able to get river trolls, stone trolls, and giant river troll hags being a significant benefit, Grimgor doesn't need any DLC to end up in a dominant position. Starting position does obviously play a huge role in this, but it isn't just the starting position. You could throw Grimgor in a far worse starting position and he'd still dominate that. But he does have an incredibly good starting position at the moment. And I like how Creative Assembly just built him up with the release of the Forge of the Chaos Dwarfs to be this biblical Armageddon level threat that they all have to deal with one way or another. Poor Greasus, you gotta feel for Greasus, because that's what he has to deal with in his campaign. But yes, Grimgor is a substantial threat. Sure, he does benefit from the DLC regiments renown and what have you, but he doesn't need them to end up steamrolling everyone around him. Then, of course, there is Morathi as the ultimate example of a legendary lord, a baseline legendary lord for a race that would do extremely well without DLC. And point of fact, Morathi needs no freaking DLC for the Dark Elves. And she is by far and away the strongest legendary lord for an entire race. Malice Darkblade does better in individual battles. Morathi does better in terms of painting the map in her colors. This is turn 39, just below turn 40, and I control Lothern. I have an alliance with Mazda Mundi, and we're painting the map in our colors. It is ridiculous. Ignore the slave number here is bugged. Mods, I believe so. But Morathi is pretty absurd. She always was absurd in Warhammer 3, even when the Dark Elves were not so great, but they did buff the Dark Elves with the release of the Forge of the Chaos Dwarves or shortly thereafter with the slave mechanic from the Chaos Dwarves being translated to the Dark Elves. So instant construction, enjoy that particular mechanic because it is incredibly powerful and potent, and you end up building a massive empire in a very short period of time. And Morathi has a combination of things. She has a relatively easy starting position over here in Titan Peaks, but on top of that, her campaign mechanics are of such a nature that they help her a great deal in terms of painting the map in her favor. The fact she has Slaaneshi corruption is an enormous benefit because it helps her with control, it helps her with income from slaves, it puts attrition on enemy armies that are trying to get through your territory. And while attrition won't necessarily do a huge amount of damage to AI armies, especially on high difficulties, it is still a pretty significant advantage. So what this all means really in practice, combined with the slave mechanic, even the vanilla one, the baseline one in Warhammer 3, what really ends up in practice is that Morathi ends up being absurdly strong very, very quickly. You want to talk about a powerful legendary lord? Morathi is one of the ultimate empire builders in the campaign. Grimgor is really powerful, but everyone will probably have to fight you. Morathi, she's beloved, like making an alliance with Lizardmen, being able to maintain some kind of non-aggression deal with Alariel, while conquering much of Ulthuan. There's power, and then there's Morathi. She's on a completely different level in a campaign compared to the vast majority of other legendary lords. As I said, the best for her race. Yes, as I stated, Malice Darkblade is good in duels. Halibran isn't too bad, but Halibran's got nothing on Morathi. Actually, I'd argue the only real competition Morathi has in a campaign is actually Lokir. Lokir is much better early on, but he doesn't have the same kind of empire-building ability that Morathi does have. Her ability in combat is also enormous. She does get the benefit to sacrifice a Hecate. That's not really too important, but when we're looking at her special skill line, she gets more slaves from battle, income post-battle loot, casualty replenishment, unit experience, diplomatic relations with Norscan Beastmen for whatever reason, more Slaaneshi corruption, and minus 30% upkeep for her army. Tyrion's benefit is stronger to be sure, but that minus 30% upkeep is significant in the early game. And because of the black arcs that the Dark Elves do have, you end up being able to field an absurd level of armies fairly quickly in your campaign. Like looking at the situation, I have 2 armies north, I have 2 armies on the western coast of Ulthuan, well, 1.5 if you will, 1.5, and 2 more on the southern and eastern sides of Ulthuan. One is just besieging Tor of Rest. Actually, yeah, so I have 3 armies, 5 armies in Ulthuan alone, 7 armies in total by turn 76 real armies, and an extra one with some that's currently recruiting some units. The Dark Elves are a powerful race. I do resent people for saying that they were bad when Warhammer 3 came out, because they were certainly not bad. And now, with the construction benefit of the Chaos Dwarves, it is far stronger. This is how things should be handled. This is the most extreme example, because this is one of the few cases in the game where the baseline legendary lord is so strong, even without DLC, where the DLC feels rather meaningless. The only real benefit you get from DLC with Moravi is our Regiments of Renown, which aren't that great anyway, and the Masters as heroes. That's it. Everything else, like the armies she's using, the unit roster she wants to go for, her campaign plans, all that, those are mostly handled with the baseline Dark Elven roster. Black Ark Corsairs and Dark Shards are just really powerful units. You do spice it up, of course, with some DLC units, but DLC is not at all really important over here, with the exception of the Masters, but you can handle things quite fine even without the Masters in this campaign. It just gives you that extra edge to do something like this. And these are just examples of where I think Creative Assembly handled it quite well, because the DLC lords are still solid enough, right? Malice is pretty solid. Talabron isn't too bad, as stated. I think she gets a bad rap from the community, when in fact she's actually a lot better than people think she is. Grom is obviously really powerful. Skarsnik is pathetic, though, for the Greenskins. And for the High Elves, yes, Elfarian and Alariel are still powerful legendary lords, though Tyrion can and does compete with them. But now let's look at some examples where Creative Assembly did really embrace that pay-to-win mentality that we're now seeing with Shadows of Change. And of course, what better example than the Prophet and the Warlock DLC that involves Lizraman and Skaven. For the Lizraman, it's not really important. For the Skaven, however, this DLC has long been considered essential for the Skaven experience in Total War Warhammer, and it's easy to understand why. Jezzails and Railing Gunners are two very, very significant units to have in your campaign, and Ikka certainly stands head and shoulders above Skrulk and Queek in quite a lot of ways. I mean, you can be fairly competitive as Queek and Skrulk, but you do need DLC in order to do so. That's where things do become pay to win, when you have a DLC of this nature. In point of fact, with Skaven, I would argue all of their DLCs, well, with the exception of perhaps the Twisted and Twilight, but certainly Clan Ishin and Clan Scryer, so Shadow and Blade, Prophet and Warlock, are absolutely pay to win DLCs because they give you a substantial number of units that are really powerful, and they give you legendary lords that themselves are really powerful. I mean, Snitch is the most powerful legendary lord for the Skaven by far, given his campaign mechanics, given the units he has, and his particular playstyle as well as starting position. Ikka, you do have to work for it, but the power is certainly there. I mean, hell, the fact that Ikka has nuclear weapons is pretty indicative of how powerful this fellow is. So Skaven are an example of a race where Creative Assembly really did embrace the idea of pay to win. Nukes, Railing Gunners, Jezzails, other options, those are really powerful. And that's just Ikka. And then you look at Clan Mulder, you look at Clan Ishin, you look at what they have, and you end up with 3 really powerful legendary lords, where the baseline legendary lords, either Queek or Skrull, can only compete by using DLC units, heroes, lords from those DLCs. That's the only way Queek and Skrull can compete with Ikka, Snitch, and Front. That's simply the case there for Skaven. It is a lot of fun to play these DLCs, but is absolutely a pay-to-win situation for the Skaven. Of course, the ultimate example of a legendary lord that stands far above the others in his race and is a paid DLC lord is Oxyotl for the Lizardmen. The Lizardmen are okay as a race, even if you don't have the DLC, but Oxyotl really stands heads and shoulders above all the others. He's stronger than the others combined, even, considering his campaign mechanics. Like, he leads an army of skirmisher units that get significant strengths faction-wide as you level them up. He further boosts them with his Lord effects, like armor-piercing missile damage and all the skills available over here. And he has the ability of teleporting around the campaign map, so he's not stuck to a single position. He has every climate in the game suitable for him. There's very few legendary lords that have that kind of ability. Oxyotl does it, and he doesn't have a trespass problem, diplomatic. He ignores the diplomatic penalty from trespassing. So teleport around the map, break someone, and then get out, because no one's really going to care except your victim. And your victim is not going to be able to stand up to you. Axolotl is absurd. And that's just some of the benefits that this guy has. He then has these missions, the visions of the old ones on the campaign map that give him significant rewards. Like his starting objective to eliminate a minor faction of Khorne, which is very, very easy to do over here, gives him 5,000 gold, giving him a significantly a significant amount of power from the very beginning of his campaign. He also literally has two starting heroes, because he has the one he starts with, of course, and then he can recruit another one instantly as well as King Chief. There aren't many races and lords that do have those kind of advantages, and Axolotl is certainly far above the other Lizarding lords that the Lizardmen do have. This is pay to win taken to certainly a very high level. And of course, with this DLC, you also have Tarax, who's the most powerful Lizarding lord of the Beastmen by far. So we have DLCs that don't really matter, and then we have DLCs that do matter a great deal. Now, having looked at all of those Legendary Lords, here's what I believe, based on the information we have available. People say, oh, things can change. If Creative Assembly was going to make major changes to the existing Lords, they would have announced that, most likely. They haven't. They've talked about some of the changing of ways, changes they're making for that will affect Kairos, but doesn't feel like it's going to be anything substantial, which is a problem. Now, Cafe doesn't necessarily need substantial changes to work, but it does feel like Miaoying and Xiaoming are going to be left in the dust compared to the Jade Dragon. And so we're in the situation where we have the most expensive DLC in the entire history of the series, really, with changes that wouldn't feel out of place in a DLC like Queen and the Crone. Yes, we have to go all the way back to Queen and the Crone as the DLC to have anything that's even remotely similar. And suffice it to say, Queen and the Crone, it didn't have major racial changes for either Dark Elves or High Elves, but they were already pretty solid races on their own. This is the thing, it's one thing to do that for races that are relatively okay. Sure, they might have their issues, but races that are pretty strong by default, it's one thing to not make those kind of racial changes. It's another thing entirely where they're making a DLC for races like Tzeentch and races like Kislev that do absolutely need significant buffs to be competitive on the campaign map, and it just feels like the power is going to be in the DLC Legendary Lords. So it's more of a situation similar to what we encountered with Axolotl and the Skaven DLC Lords, as opposed to something that we got in the past, where we did get powerful Legendary Lords for certain races as part of DLCs, but the existing ones were already strong enough. And I think that, in conclusion, that Shadows of Change certainly is a pay-to-win DLC, based on the information we have available right now. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.